Snow piled against the hewn logs of the cabin walls, a silent and suffocating weight that had been accumulating for 3 days without pause, sealing the valley in a tomb of white that erased the horizon and the sky alike. Matthias sat in the solitary wooden chair he had fashioned years ago, his back to the frosted window, staring into the heart of the iron stove where the last of the oak logs were surrendering to the heat. The cabin smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of a rifle that had just been cleaned and oiled, a scent that was more familiar to him now than the smell of bread or rain. He did not look at the calendar pinned to the wall near his bunk, for the date held no significance beyond the calculation of winter stores, yet he knew by the slant of the light earlier in the day and the depth of the drift that it was the 24th of December. The knowledge sat in his chest like a cold stone, heavy and unmoving, a reminder of a life that had been stripped away layer by layer until only the core of survival remained. There was no festive wreath upon the door, no candle burning in the window to guide a wayward traveler, for in this part of the territory, travel during such a freeze was a sentence of death, and Matthias had long ago ceased hoping for visitors of any kind. He watched the flames lick at the grate, his rough hands resting on his knees, hands that were scarred from labor and cracked from the dry, biting air, hands that had forgotten the sensation of holding anything softer than the stock of a gun or the handle of an axe. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the settling of the timbers as they contracted in the cold, and the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the clock on the mantel, counting down seconds that no one else was around to hear. He was a man suspended in amber, waiting for the winter to pass, or for the years to run out, indifferent to which came first, existing in a state of quiet, disciplined endurance that had turned his heart as hard and impenetrable as the frozen earth beneath the floorboards. The sound that broke the stillness was not the howl of the gale, or the snap of a branch under the weight of the snow, but a dull, rhythmic thud against the heavy oak of the door, a sound so unexpected and alien that Matthias did not move at first, convinced it was a trick of the mind, born from too many hours of staring into the fire. It came again, weaker this time, a desperate, frantic scratching that suggested something dying rather than something hunting, and the instinct that had kept him alive in the high country for a decade kicked in with a jolt of adrenaline that cleared the fog of his brooding. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and crossed the small room in 2 long strides, his hand closing around the cold barrel of the repeating rifle leaning against the wall, his thumb instinctively finding the hammer, though he did not cock it. He stood by the door, listening to the wind tear at the corners of the cabin, waiting for the sound to repeat, his breath hanging in the air before him in a thin white cloud, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. When the knock came a 3rd time, it was barely a whisper, the sound of knuckles sliding against wood as strength failed, and Matthias unlatched the heavy iron bolt with a clang that echoed in the small space, bracing his shoulder against the wood to keep the wind from ripping it from his grasp. He pulled the door open, shielding his eyes against the sudden assault of blinding white and stinging ice, prepared to shout at a bear or a wolf, but instead his gaze fell downward to the figure crumpled on the threshold. She was a splash of color in a monochrome world, a stroke of gray and vibrant red against the relentless white, her body curled inward as if trying to preserve the last spark of heat within her core. He saw the gray prairie dress, soaked and stiff with ice at the hem, and the bright red scarf wrapped wind-tattered around her neck, a beacon of distress that cut through the gloom of the twilight storm. Matthias did not ask questions, nor did he hesitate to weigh the risks of charity against the safety of his isolation, for the sight of a human being freezing to death on his doorstep bypassed the guarded fortress of his cynicism and tapped directly into a primal, unspoken duty. He dropped the rifle to the floor, the metal clattering loudly, and bent down, scooping her up in his arms with a grunt of exertion, surprised by how little she weighed, as if the cold had already hollowed her out and left only the shell behind. She was limp, her head lolling back against his shoulder, her skin possessing the terrifying, translucent pallor of marble, and for a fleeting second he feared he was carrying a corpse into his sanctuary. He kicked the door shut with his boot, sealing out the roar of the storm and plunging the room back into the quiet crackle of the fire, the sudden absence of the wind making his own heavy breathing sound loud and intrusive. He carried her to the rug before the stove, laying her down with a gentleness that felt foreign to his clumsy hands, arranging her limbs so they were near the warmth but not close enough to burn the frost-bitten skin. As the firelight washed over her, he saw her clearly for the first time. A Chinese woman, perhaps no more than 25, her features delicate and still, her dark hair plastered to her forehead by melted snow. She looked entirely out of place, a ghost from a different world dropped into the harsh reality of the frontier winter, and the mystery of her presence gnawed at him even as he moved to pile blankets over her shivering form. He stripped the wet red scarf from her neck, the wool damp and heavy, and set it aside, the color looking violent and alive against the dull brown of the cabin floor, a stark reminder that the world outside had breached his walls. The transition from the lethal cold of the storm to the suffocating heat of the cabin began to rouse her, a painful thawing process that manifested in small, jerky tremors that shook her entire frame beneath the heavy wool blankets Matthias had heaped upon her. He stood back, leaning against the rough-hewn table, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, his arms crossed over his chest as if to physically bar himself from getting too involved, even though he had already saved her life. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, ragged and shallow at first, then deepening as the warmth began to penetrate the layers of her sodden clothing, the fire casting dancing shadows across her face that made her expression seem to shift between pain and peace. He should have asked her name, should have demanded to know how she had come to be alone in the wilderness in the dead of winter, but the words stuck in his throat, deemed unnecessary and cruel in the face of such obvious suffering. Instead, he moved to the stove, his movements efficient and practiced, lifting the iron kettle to check the water level, the clink of metal on metal the only sound in the room as he prepared to make something hot to drink. He felt a strange intrusion in the space, the air shifting to accommodate another pair of lungs, the solitude that was his oldest companion retreating into the corners of the room to watch with jealous eyes. She stirred, a low moan escaping her lips, and Matthias froze, the kettle suspended in his hand, watching as her eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented, reflecting the orange glow of the embers as she tried to piece together the fractured reality of her survival. She pushed herself up on one elbow, the blanket slipping from her shoulders to reveal the sodden gray fabric of her dress, her gaze darting around the cabin with the frantic energy of a trapped bird before settling on him, the dark figure looming by the stove. There was fear in her eyes, sharp and immediate, but it was quickly eclipsed by a wave of exhaustion that pulled her back down, her strength insufficient to sustain even the simple act of sitting upright. Matthias stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and knelt beside her, holding out a tin cup filled with hot broth he had ladled from the pot that always simmered at the back of the stove. "Drink," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, the single word sounding loud and commanding in the small space, though he had meant it to be an offer. She looked at the cup, then at his face, searching for kindness in the harsh lines of his weathered skin and the dark, unreadable depth of his eyes, and after a moment of hesitation, she reached out with trembling hands to take it. Her fingers brushed against his, her skin ice cold against his calloused warmth, a shock of contact that made him draw back slightly, unused to the touch of another living being. She brought the cup to her lips, the steam rising to wreath her face in mist, and took a small tentative sip, the heat flushing her cheeks with a faint, sudden color. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heavily accented but clear, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone, fragile and broken. Matthias nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and stood up, retreating to the safety of the shadows, realizing with a sudden dull ache that he was no longer alone on Christmas Eve, and that the silence he had so carefully cultivated had been shattered beyond repair. The darkness of the cabin was not total, for the embers in the stove cast a low, pulsing red light that breathed in time with the wind outside, illuminating the rough textures of the walls and the stillness of the woman sleeping on the floor. Matthias had not slept, his body rigid in the chair he had pulled into the corner, a position that offered him a tactical view of the door and the window, though he knew the storm was the only intruder likely to breach his perimeter that night. He watched the stranger, whose name he did not yet know, and found himself wrestling with a disquiet that had nothing to do with the threat of violence, and everything to do with the resurrection of memories he had long ago buried beneath the frozen earth. Her presence in the room changed the density of the air, making it heavier, charged with the fragile rhythm of her breathing which caught and hitched every few minutes as the trauma of the cold worked its way out of her lungs. He found himself cataloging the details of her face as the firelight washed over it, the high arch of her cheekbones, the delicate sweep of her jaw, and the way her dark hair, now drying and curling slightly at the ends, spilled over the rough wool of the blanket like ink on parchment. It had been 5 years since a woman had slept in this room, 5 years since the softness of a female presence had tempered the hard, masculine edges of his survival, and the sudden reintroduction of that energy felt less like a gift and more like a haunting. He shifted his weight, the wood of the chair groaning softly, and her eyes flew open instantly, wide and dark and filled with the disoriented panic of a hunted animal waking in a snare. She scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the logs of the wall, clutching the blanket to her chest as her gaze darted wildly around the shadowy room before locking onto him. Matthias did not move, keeping his hands visible on his knees, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble that was meant to soothe, but sounded like gravel grinding together. "You are safe," he said, the words hanging in the air between them, heavy and absolute. "The storm is still blowing. There is nowhere else to go." Morning did not break so much as it bruised the sky, a dull, expansive gray light filtering through the frosted panes of the single window to reveal the claustrophobic intimacy of their confinement. The snow had drifted halfway up the glass, blocking the view of the valley and turning the cabin into a capsule floating in a white void, disconnected from the geography of the territory. The woman, who had finally whispered that her name was Leanne, moved around the small space with a tentative, limping grace, her strength returning in slow, measured increments that mirrored the rising of the sun she could not see. She had insisted on taking over the small domestic tasks that defined Matthias's morning ritual, ignoring his initial grunts of protest to wipe down the table and stir the porridge on the stove, her movements efficient and practiced, despite the tremors that still occasionally shook her hands. Matthias watched her from the periphery, pretending to clean the mechanism of his rifle, but his attention was entirely fixed on the way she navigated his world, touching his battered tin plates and worn tools with a reverence they did not deserve. There was a tension in the silence, but it was not the hostility of strangers. Rather, it was the awkward, vibrating awareness of two solitary creatures forced into a shared orbit. She paused by the window, her hand resting on the icy glass, and he saw the tension in her shoulders, the unspoken worry for whatever journey had been interrupted by the blizzard. "The pass will be closed for days," Matthias said, not looking up from the gun in his lap, the oil rag moving in slow, rhythmic circles over the metal. "Even when the snow stops, the drifts will be too deep for a horse, let alone a walker." Leanne turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the flat light, though he detected a flicker of resignation in her dark eyes. "I have no horse," she said softly, her voice carrying a lilt that softened the harsh edges of the frontier dialect. "I was walking to the settlement at Granite Creek. My husband, he waits for me there." The mention of a husband hung in the room, a phantom third presence that Matthias acknowledged with a stoic nod, feeling a strange, inexplicable pang of disappointment that he immediately crushed under the weight of his pragmatism. By the time evening descended again, bringing with it a drop in temperature that made the cabin timbers pop like rifle shots, the dynamic between them had shifted from wary coexistence to a quiet, functional partnership. They sat near the stove, the heat radiating outward in waves that kept the encroaching freeze at bay, sharing a meal of salted venison and hardtack that Leanne had managed to soften into a stew using the dried herbs she found in a jar on the shelf. It was Christmas night, a fact Matthias had intended to ignore, but the ritual of breaking bread with another human being forced a recognition of the date that he could not suppress. He watched her eat, noting the delicacy with which she held the spoon, a stark contrast to the rough, utilitarian manner in which he consumed his own food, and he felt the urge to speak, to bridge the gap of silence that stretched across the table. "You traveled a long way to be caught in this," he said, the sentence functioning as both an observation and a question. Leanne lowered her spoon, her gaze drifting to the red scarf that was now draped over the back of the chair to dry, its vibrant color looking like a wound in the dim light. "We came from the coast," she answered, her eyes distant, looking through the walls of the cabin to a past he could only imagine. "The wagon broke a wheel 3 days back. The others, they argued. I thought I could make the walk before the sky turned. I was wrong." She looked at him then, a direct, piercing gaze that stripped away his defenses. "You live here alone? By choice?" Matthias looked into the fire, the flames dancing in the reflection of his eyes, seeing the ghosts of his own history flickering in the coals. "The world is loud," he murmured, a confession he had never spoken aloud, "and it takes more than it gives. Here, the terms are simple. You work, you survive. You stop, you die." It was a bleak philosophy, one he had worn like armor for a decade, but hearing it spoken in the presence of this woman, whose resilience was driven by love rather than avoidance, made it sound hollow and cowardly. The storm broke on the 3rd day, the howling wind dying down to a whisper before vanishing entirely, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a ringing in the ears. The sun emerged with a blinding, violent brilliance, reflecting off the miles of pristine white that covered the valley floor, and transforming the world into a landscape of diamonds and razor-sharp shadows. Matthias opened the door, the heavy wood scraping against the accumulation on the porch, and stepped out into the biting cold, squinting against the glare as he assessed the path to the main trail. The liberation of the landscape meant the end of their suspended reality, a return to the linear progression of time that demanded movement and separation. He spent the morning shoveling a path, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the heavy, churning emotion in his gut, while inside he could hear the soft sounds of Leanne gathering her few possessions. When he returned to the cabin, shaking the snow from his boots, she was standing by the stove, the red scarf once again wrapped around her neck, her face set in a mask of determined gratitude. She looked healthier now. The color returned to her cheeks, the haunting pallor of the hypothermia replaced by the golden undertones of her skin, and Matthias was struck by her beauty in a way he had not allowed himself to be when she was a fragile, dying thing. "The snow is crusted hard," he told her, keeping his voice flat and professional. "You can walk on top of it if you move carefully. Granite Creek is 10 miles east. If you leave now, you will make the lights before dark." He did not offer to guide her. To leave his post would be to admit that his isolation was a prison rather than a fortress, and he was not ready to surrender that illusion, not even for her. She stood in the doorway, a small, vibrant figure framed against the immense, indifferent backdrop of the white wilderness, and for a moment neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with the phantom touch of a connection that had no name and no future, born of survival and extinguished by safety. Leanne reached out, her hand hovering for a second before lightly touching the sleeve of his rough canvas coat, a gesture of intimacy that burned through the fabric and branded his skin. "You saved me," she said simply, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away, yet he found he could not. Not just from the cold. She did not explain what she meant, and he did not ask, but he understood that the silence of the cabin had been a sanctuary for her as much as it had been a shelter. Then she turned, stepping off the porch and onto the hard-packed snow, her boots crunching rhythmically as she began the long trek toward the horizon, where the smoke of the settlement would eventually rise. Matthias watched her go, standing like a sentinel in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white. He watched until the red of her scarf was nothing more than a heartbeat against the snow, a tiny spark of life vanishing into the vast, frozen indifference of the west. Only when she was gone, truly gone, did he step back inside and close the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. He walked to the chair by the fire and sat down, the silence of the room rushing back in to fill the space she had occupied. But as he stared into the flames, he realized that the silence was no longer empty. It was full of her memory, a bittersweet ache that proved, despite everything, he was still capable of feeling the warmth of another human soul.